Cowboys Dark Secret. Isabel Belle Monroe had always been careful, never betting more than she could afford to lose. But when Cass Crow slid a stack of poker chips toward her, his smirk slow and knowing, she knew she was outmatched. He leaned in, fingers brushing hers. "You got two choices, sugar," he murmured. "Walk away, or take a chance on me." Chapter 1. The dust settles on a broken promise. The wind, a restless spirit itself, whipped through the skeletal remains of the cottonwood tree, its branches clawing at the bruised twilight sky. Isabel Belle Monroe watched it from the porch of the Weather homestead, the rough-hewn wood groaning beneath her worn boots. The dust, fine and red as powdered brick, settled on everything, the porch swing hanging limp and lifeless, the cracked leather of her father's old saddle slung over the railing, even the lines etched deep around her eyes, a testament to too many years squinting against the harsh sun and the even harsher realities of life on the frontier. She was 58, but the years felt heavier, each one a stone added to the burden she carried. The weight of the ranch, the dwindling herd, the gnawing loneliness, it all pressed down, a suffocating blanket woven from regret and what-ifs. Her gaze drifted towards the distant mesa, its silhouette a jagged, purple scar against the fading light. He'd promised he'd be back before the first snow. That was 5 winters ago. 5 years since Thomas, her husband, the steady, dependable anchor of her life, had ridden off to track down a band of rustlers who'd made off with a dozen of their best cattle. 5 years since she'd last seen the crinkle at the corner of his eyes when he smiled, the way his calloused hand fit perfectly in hers. The sheriff, a portly man named Abernathy, with a face like a crumpled saddlebag and a perpetually weary sigh, had brought the news. Thomas had been found, or what was left of him, in a shallow ravine, a single bullet hole marring his forehead. Ambushed. Abernathy had mumbled something about justice, about tracking down the killers, but Belle had barely heard him. The world had narrowed to the cold, hard knot in her stomach, the roaring silence that had swallowed her whole. She'd buried him beneath that same cottonwood, the one that now stood sentinel over a grave marked by a simple wooden cross, its inscription weathered and barely legible. Thomas Monroe. Beloved husband. Gone too soon. The words, stark and inadequate, mocked her grief. Belle wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the thin fabric offering little protection against the chill that seeped into her bones. It wasn't just the evening air, it was a deeper cold, a hollowness that had taken root in her soul and refused to thaw. She tried to keep the ranch going, clinging to the familiar routines, the rhythm of the seasons, the scent of hay and horses and leather. But the ranch, like her heart, was slowly crumbling. Debts were piling up, creditors were circling like vultures, and the neighboring ranchers, their eyes narrowed with a mixture of pity and predatory interest, were starting to make offers. Low offers. Insulting offers. She'd considered selling, moving back east, finding a quiet life, a life without the constant struggle, the relentless sun, the ghosts that whispered in the wind. But something held her back. Stubbornness, perhaps. Or maybe it was the memory of Thomas, his hand gripping hers as they'd stood on this very porch, surveying their land, their dream, their future. He'd believed in this place, in this life. And Belle, despite everything, still clung to a flicker of that belief, a fragile ember in the ashes of her despair. A flicker that was about to be tested. A test brought forth by a man like a desert storm. A rider appeared on the horizon, a dark silhouette against the dying light. Belle's hand instinctively went to the Winchester rifle leaning against the porch railing, her fingers wrapping around the cold steel. She wasn't afraid. Fear, like hope, was a luxury she could no longer afford. She was just wary. Wary of strangers, wary of promises, wary of anything that threatened the fragile equilibrium she'd managed to maintain. The rider approached slowly, the rhythmic thud of hooves on the hard-packed earth the only sound besides the wind. As he drew closer, Belle could make out the details, a tall figure, broad-shouldered and lean, sitting easily in the saddle. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, a dusty duster that concealed most of his frame, and a pair of well-worn boots. A rifle was slung across his back, and a Colt Peacemaker rested low on his hip. He reined in his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, at the edge of the yard, the animal snorting and pawing the ground. He dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his rugged appearance, his movements economical and deliberate. He stood there for a moment, studying her, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat. Then, he slowly removed the hat, revealing a face that was both striking and unsettling. It was a face carved from granite, weathered and lined, with a strong jaw, a straight nose, and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a startling shade of blue, like the sky after a storm, intense and piercing, with a hint of something dangerous lurking beneath the surface. Cass Crowe. The name came to her unbidden, a whisper from the wind, a memory from a past she'd tried to bury. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't a question. It was a statement and an acknowledgement. Belle straightened her shoulders, her gaze unwavering. "Mr. Crowe," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "What brings you to my ranch?" He tilted his head slightly, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "I believe we have some unfinished business, Mrs. Monroe. A bargain, if I recall correctly." The air grew still and a hawk cried somewhere above, the sound almost too close, its presence an omen. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past Whisper. The unfinished business he spoke of hung between them, heavy and unspoken, like the scent of impending rain on the dry desert air. Belle remembered it, of course. How could she forget? It was the kind of memory that clung to you, a burr under the saddle of your life, constantly reminding you of a wrong turn, a foolish decision. 5 years ago, it had seemed like a lifeline. Now it felt like a noose. "The game," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. It wasn't a question. She knew precisely what he meant. Cass Crowe nodded slowly, his blue eyes, sharp and assessing, never leaving hers. He stepped closer, the spurs on his boots jingling softly with each movement, a subtle, almost predatory sound in the gathering dusk. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of horses and leather and something else, something wilder, untamed, that made her breath catch in her throat. 5 years is a long time, Mrs. Monroe, he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air around them. A lot can change. And some things don't, Belle countered, her gaze holding his. She wouldn't flinch. She wouldn't show him any weakness. She'd learned that lesson the hard way, in a life filled with hard lessons. The game. It had been held in the back room of the Golden Nugget Saloon in Redemption, a town that lived up to its name only in the most ironic sense. Belle had gone there out of desperation, driven by the dwindling hope of saving the ranch. Thomas had been gone for weeks, the worry gnawing at her, leaving her hollow and sleepless. The bank had refused her another loan, the neighboring ranchers were circling, and she'd seen the desperation in the eyes of her ranch hands, men who had been with her and Thomas for years, men who depended on them. She'd heard whispers of Cass Crowe, a gambler with a reputation as cold and sharp as a winter wind. They said he never lost, that he had a knack for reading people, for seeing their weaknesses, their fears, their hidden desires. They said he was a man who lived by his own rules, a man who walked the line between outlaw and legend. She had sought a means to save all she held dear, and he'd offered her this gamble. She'd thought she could beat him. She'd always been good at cards, a skill honed over years of quiet evenings with Thomas, a small pleasure in a life filled with hard work. She'd thought her desperation would give her an edge, that her need would be stronger than his skill. She'd been wrong. The memory of that night was still vivid, a scene etched in her mind with the clarity of a brand on cattle. The smoky haze of the saloon, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of voices, the scent of whiskey and sweat. The faces of the other players, hardened men with eyes that had seen too much, men who lived by their wits and their guns. And Cass Crowe, sitting across from her, his face impassive, his eyes unreadable, dealing the cards with a practiced flick of his wrist. She'd played well, at first. She'd won a few hands, felt a flicker of hope, a surge of adrenaline. But Crow had been patient, letting her win, drawing her in, like a spider weaving its web. And then, when the stakes were high, when she'd bet everything she had left, he'd struck. She remembered the cards he'd laid down, a royal flush, the highest hand in the game. She remembered the silence that had fallen over the room, the stunned disbelief on the faces of the other players. She remembered the cold, hard knot in her stomach, the realization that she'd lost everything. You said you'd give me time," she'd stammered, her voice trembling. Crow had leaned back in his chair, his eyes, those unsettling blue eyes, fixed on hers. "I did," he'd said, his voice devoid of emotion. 5 years. That's a generous amount of time, even by my standards. And now, here he was, 5 years later, standing on her porch, the setting sun casting long shadows that stretched across the yard like grasping fingers. "I don't have the money, Mr. Crow," she said, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. She'd hoped, prayed even, over these many years that he would somehow have disappeared or forgotten. He smiled then, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not here for money, Mrs. Monroe." Belle's heart pounded against her ribs, a trapped bird fluttering against its cage. "Then what do you want?" He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her, enveloping her in darkness. "I want what I was promised," he said, his voice a whisper that sent a chill down her spine. "I want the ranch." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch, tossing it at her feet. "The deed, Mrs. Monroe. Signed and sealed. Just as we agreed." She looked down at the pouch and back at him, a sudden cold clarity washing over her. It wasn't just the ranch. It was something more. Something she hadn't fully understood 5 years ago, something that was only now becoming clear. It was about pride, about power, about a game that had never really ended. He saw the shift in her expression and offered, "You always were a proud one, Belle. Too proud, some would say." She bent down and picked up the pouch with its haunting contents, feeling the weight of the world contained within that old leather, feeling the weight of his gaze on her. She had to decide, and quickly. Chapter 3. A hand dealt in darkness. Belle straightened, clutching the leather pouch containing the deed. The weight of it felt disproportionate to its size, a physical manifestation of the burden she'd carried for 5 years. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep violet, a breathtaking backdrop to the silent confrontation unfolding on the weathered porch. "You knew," she said, her voice low, accusing. "You knew I wouldn't be able to pay." Cass Crow didn't deny it. He simply stood there, his posture relaxed, his hands resting lightly on his hips, the silver buckle of his gun belt glinting in the fading light. He was a predator, patient and confident, and she was his prey, cornered and vulnerable. "A gambler always assesses the odds, Mrs. Monroe," he replied, his voice smooth, devoid of any hint of remorse. "I knew your situation. I knew your desperation." The word hung in the air, a sharp, stinging reminder of her weakness, her folly. She hated him for it, for his cold calculation, for the way he'd exploited her vulnerability. But she also hated herself, for her naivete, for her pride, for the reckless gamble that had brought her to this point. "You could have helped me," she said, the words a whisper of regret, of what might have been. "You could have offered me a loan, a fair price for the ranch." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that grated on her nerves. "And where's the sport in that, Mrs. Monroe? Where's the challenge? I prefer a game with stakes, with consequences." "And what about Thomas?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and anger. "Did you know about him, too? Was that part of your game?" The question seemed to take him by surprise. For the first time since he'd arrived, a flicker of something other than cold amusement crossed his face. It might have been regret, or perhaps just annoyance at having his carefully constructed facade disturbed. "Your husband's death was unfortunate," he said, his voice losing some of its smoothness. But it wasn't my doing. I don't deal in murder, Mrs. Monroe. I'm a gambler, not a killer. Belle wasn't sure she believed him. She'd learned that men like Cass Crowe lived in a world of shadows, where truth was a slippery commodity, where loyalty was a weakness, and where survival often depended on blurring the lines between right and wrong. But you profited from it, she said, her gaze unwavering. His death made it easier for you. It made me weaker. He shrugged, a gesture that was both dismissive and arrogant. Circumstances change. A wise man adapts. And a wise woman? Belle asked, her voice laced with bitterness. What does she do? He stepped closer, his eyes locking with hers. She survives, he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur. By any means necessary. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers calloused but surprisingly gentle. Belle flinched at his touch, a mixture of revulsion and a strange, unsettling awareness of his physical presence. You're a survivor, Belle, he said, his voice softening, losing some of its hard edge. I see it in your eyes. You've got fire in you, Grit. You're not like those other women, those pampered, soft creatures who faint at the sight of a little blood. Belle pulled away from his touch, her cheeks burning. Don't you dare compare me to anyone, she said, her voice trembling with anger. You know nothing about me, about what I've been through. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made her skin crawl. I know more than you think, Mrs. Monroe. I know about the years you spent slaving away on this ranch, working alongside your husband, building a life from nothing. I know about the sacrifices you made, the dreams you deferred. I know about the loneliness that eats away at you, the emptiness that haunts your nights. His words were like a knife twisting in her gut, exposing the raw, vulnerable places she'd tried so hard to hide. She hated him for seeing her, for understanding her, for knowing her weaknesses. Get off my property, Crow, she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and despair. Take the deed, take the ranch, take everything. Just leave me alone. He didn't move. He simply stood there, watching her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of calculation and something else. Something that looked almost like pity. That's not the bargain we made, Belle, he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. I offered you a choice. You chose to gamble. And you lost. There was no choice, Belle whispered, the fight draining out of her. There's always a choice, he countered quietly, then paused. I'm not unreasonable, Belle. I have a proposition. His eyes seemed to bore into her, seeking something deeper than her anger. He seemed to search for the woman he'd met 5 years before, desperate and hopeful, a woman who still existed somewhere beneath the grief and hardship. Chapter 4. The Weight of a Worn Wedding Ring. Belle stared at him, her mind reeling.
A proposition?
After everything, after the calculated cruelty, the cold indifference, he was offering her a proposition? The audacity of it was breathtaking, yet a sliver of desperate hope, a tiny, flickering ember she thought long extinguished, began to glow within her. What kind of proposition? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, wary of another trap, another layer to his intricate game. Cass Crowe stepped back, giving her a sliver of breathing room, a small concession that felt both calculated and strangely respectful. He gestured towards the porch swing, the one that had remained empty since Thomas's death. Let's sit, he said, his voice losing some of its hard edge. This might take a while.
Belle hésitait.
Sitting with him, sharing the space that had once been her and Thomas's sanctuary, felt like a betrayal. But she was also exhausted, bone-weary from the constant struggle, the relentless pressure. And she was curious, despite her better judgment. What could he possibly offer that wouldn't be another form of torment? She slowly lowered herself onto the swing, the wood creaking beneath her weight, a mournful sound that echoed the ache in her heart. Crow sat down beside her, leaving a respectable distance, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, a subtle reminder of his physical presence. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. The stars were beginning to appear, scattered across the vast, inky canvas of the night sky, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. "I'm not interested in running a ranch," Crow said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was low, conversational, a stark contrast to the menacing tone he'd used earlier. "I'm a gambler, not a cattleman. My interests lie elsewhere." Belle waited, her heart pounding against her ribs. She knew there was a catch, a hidden hook in his words. There always was with Cass Crow. But, he continued, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon, "I do recognize the value of this land, of this ranch. And I recognize your attachment to it." He glanced at her, his blue eyes, sharp and perceptive, seeming to see right through her, to the core of her being. Belle instinctively reached for the worn, silver wedding ring on her finger, the one Thomas had placed there so many years ago, a symbol of their love, their commitment, their shared dream. She twisted it nervously, the smooth metal a tangible link to the past, a reminder of what she had lost and what she was about to lose again. "I need a partner," Crow said, choosing his words carefully. "Someone who knows the land, the cattle, the business. Someone I can trust." He paused, letting his words sink in. Belle stared at him, her mind struggling to grasp the implications of his offer. He was proposing a partnership? With her? The woman he'd cheated? The woman he'd driven to the brink of ruin? It was absurd, unbelievable. "Why me?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "You could find plenty of experienced ranchers, men who would try to cheat me, lie to me, take advantage of my absence." Crow interrupted, his voice turning hard again. "I need someone who's honest, someone who's loyal, someone who has a stake in this ranch's success." He turned to face her, his eyes locking with hers. "You need this ranch, Belle," he said, his voice soft, almost persuasive. "And I need you." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. It was a bargain, a different kind of bargain than the one they'd made 5 years ago. This time, it wasn't about cards and money. It was about survival, about a fragile alliance forged out of necessity and desperation. It was also, Belle realized with a sudden jolt of understanding, about something more. It was about a challenge, a game of a different sort. He was testing her, pushing her, seeing if she had the strength, the courage, to accept his offer, to play his game, to risk everything again. She looked at him, at his hard, weathered face, at his eyes that held both danger and a strange, unsettling vulnerability. She thought of Thomas, of his love, his unwavering belief in her. She thought of the ranch, of the years of hard work, the sweat and tears that had been poured into this land. She looked down at her wedding ring, the silver gleaming faintly in the starlight. She'd made a promise. To Thomas, and to herself, to hold this land, and to survive. She took a deep breath, the cool night air filling her lungs. "What are the terms, Mr. Crow?" she asked, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. The game, it seemed, was far from over. It was, in fact, just beginning. The crickets chirruped in the dark and something wild darted through the underbrush close to the porch. Chapter 5. Echoes in an empty saloon. The terms, as Cass Crow laid them out, were stark, yet strangely appealing in their brutal honesty. He wasn't offering charity, he was offering a business proposition, a partnership forged in the crucible of mutual need. Belle would manage the ranch, oversee the day-to-day operations, handle the cattle, the hands, the endless cycle of branding, herding, and selling. Crow, in turn, would provide the capital, the protection, and the connections needed to ensure the ranch's survival and, he hoped, its eventual prosperity. He made no pretense of sentimentality. He spoke of profit margins, market fluctuations, and the ruthless realities of the cattle business. He spoke of the dangers they faced, the rival ranchers, the rustlers, the ever-present threat of drought and disease. He spoke of the need for trust, for loyalty, for a shared understanding of the risks involved. Belle listened intently, her mind racing, weighing the pros and cons, the potential benefits against the inherent dangers. She knew he was holding something back, that there were layers to his plan, secrets he wasn't revealing. But she also sensed an opportunity, a chance to reclaim what she'd lost, to rebuild her life, to honor Thomas's memory. You'll be gone, she said, stating the obvious. Most of the time. Crow nodded. My business takes me elsewhere. I'll be back periodically to check on things, to consult. His eyes, those piercing blue eyes, held hers, a silent challenge, a question unspoken. Could she handle it? Could she run the ranch on her own, make the tough decisions, face the inevitable challenges without him? I've been running this ranch alone for 5 years, Belle replied, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. I'm not afraid of hard work. I'm not afraid of making decisions. A flicker of admiration crossed his face, a subtle acknowledgement of her strength, her resilience. I know you're not, he said, his voice softening. That's why I'm making this offer. He leaned back, studying her, his gaze assessing. There's one more thing, he said, his voice turning serious again. A condition.
Belle brassait d'herself.
Here it comes, she thought, the catch, the hidden hook. I need you to keep my involvement quiet, he said, choosing his words carefully. No one can know I'm a partner in this ranch. Not the hands, not the neighbors, not the sheriff. No one.
Belle frowned. Why?
He shrugged, a gesture that was both evasive and dismissive. Let's just say I have enemies. People who wouldn't be happy to know I have a stake in this land. Belle knew he was referring to his life as a gambler, a life that undoubtedly involved shady dealings, dangerous rivals, and a constant need for secrecy. It was a world she knew little about, a world she didn't want to be a part of. But she also understood the need for discretion. The ranch had enough enemies as it was, she didn't need to add to the list. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the night sounds of the frontier. Belle thought of the empty saloon in town, the Golden Nugget, where she'd lost everything. The echoes of that night, the clinking glasses, the murmurs of voices, the cold, hard reality of her defeat, seemed to reverberate in the quiet air. It was in that saloon, amidst the wreckage of her hopes, that this strange, twisted path had begun. And now, ironically, it was offering her a chance to reclaim what she'd lost, to rebuild her life, to find a measure of redemption. But at what cost? She looked at Crow, his face shadowed in the darkness, his eyes unreadable. He was a dangerous man, a man who lived by his own rules, a man who could offer her salvation or damnation. If anyone asks, Crow continued, his voice a low, insistent murmur, you're the sole owner. You're the one in charge. I'm just a silent investor. A ghost. A ghost. Like Thomas. Like the memories that haunted her, the dreams that whispered in the wind. She thought of the ranch hands, loyal men who had stood by her through thick and thin. She thought of the neighboring ranchers, their suspicious eyes, their predatory interest. She thought of the sheriff, Abernathy, with his weary sighs and his futile attempts to bring justice to this lawless land. Could she lie to them? Could she maintain the facade, keep the secret, live with the constant fear of discovery? She looked down at her hands, calloused and worn from years of hard work. They were the hands of a rancher, a survivor, a woman who had faced adversity and loss and had somehow managed to keep going. She looked up at Crow, her decision made. I agree, she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. On one condition. Crow raised an eyebrow, a silent question. I make the decisions, Belle said, her voice strong, resolute. About the ranch, about the cattle, about everything. You may be the silent partner, but I'm the one in charge. He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Fair enough, Mrs. Monroe, he said. Fair enough. He stood up, extending his hand to her. Belle hesitated for a moment, then took it. His grip was strong, firm, a silent acknowledgement of the bargain they had struck, the partnership they had forged. As he turned to leave, mounting his horse with the same fluid grace he displayed earlier, he paused, looking back at her. Don't disappoint me, Belle, he said, his voice low, serious. I don't like to lose. And with that, he rode off into the night, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Belle alone on the porch, the echoes of the empty saloon swirling around her, the weight of her decision settling upon her shoulders. A lone owl hooted, A lonely sound, and Belle felt a chill despite the warmth of the lingering day. Chapter 6. The Price of Freedom, the Cost of Trust. The days that followed were a blur of activity, a whirlwind of work and worry. Belle threw herself into the ranch with a renewed sense of purpose, driven by a mixture of determination and a desperate need to prove herself, to Crow, to herself, to the memory of Thomas. She rose before dawn, her boots echoing on the wooden floor of the old house, the scent of coffee brewing a familiar comfort in the pre-dawn chill. She worked alongside her hands, mending fences, tending to the cattle, overseeing the branding of the new calves. The men, a motley crew of weathered cowboys and young, eager ranch hands, seemed to sense the change in her, the newfound resolve, the steely glint in her eyes. They respected her, not just because she was the owner, but because she worked as hard as they did, because she knew the land, the cattle, the business, as well as any of them. They'd been with her and Thomas for years, through thick and thin, and their loyalty, though tested by the recent hardships, remained unwavering. There was Jed, the foreman, a grizzled old-timer with a face like a roadmap of the frontier and a heart of gold, despite his gruff exterior. He'd been with Thomas since they were both young men, and he'd taken Belle under his wing after Thomas's death, offering his support, his guidance, his quiet strength. Then there was young Billy, barely out of his teens, full of youthful exuberance and a naive belief in the romantic ideals of the West. He was eager to learn, quick to smile, and fiercely loyal to Belle, seeing in her a surrogate mother figure, a source of strength and stability in his chaotic world. And there were others, each with their own stories, their own reasons for choosing this hard, unforgiving life. They were a family of sorts, bound together by the shared challenges, the camaraderie of the open range, the unspoken bond of those who depended on each other for survival. Belle kept Crow's involvement a secret, as they'd agreed. She told the men she'd secured a loan, a private investor, a silent partner who preferred to remain anonymous. They accepted her explanation without question, their trust in her absolute. But the secrecy gnawed at her, a constant source of unease. She hated lying to them, to Jed, to Billy, to the men who had stood by her through thick and thin. It felt like a betrayal of their loyalty, a violation of the unspoken code of trust that bound them together. The neighboring ranchers were another source of concern. They were a suspicious lot, their eyes narrowed with a mixture of curiosity and predatory interest. They'd seen the ranch struggling, they'd smelled the blood in the water, and they'd been circling, waiting for the opportune moment to swoop in and pick the bones clean. Belle knew she had to be careful, to project an image of strength, of confidence, of solvency. She couldn't afford to show any weakness, any vulnerability. She had to convince them that the ranch was thriving, that she was in control, that she wasn't about to sell, no matter how low their offers. She met with them, one by one, in the dusty, sun-baked town of Redemption, in the same saloon where she'd lost everything to Crow. She sat at the same table, felt the same ghosts swirling around her, the echoes of that fateful night a constant reminder of the price of failure. She listened to their offers, their veiled threats, their condescending attempts to persuade her to sell. She remained calm, composed, her face a mask of polite indifference. She told them she wasn't interested, that the ranch wasn't for sale, that she had plans, a future. They didn't believe her, of course. They saw her as a lone woman, vulnerable and desperate, an easy target. They underestimated her, just as Crow had underestimated her 5 years ago. And that, Belle realized, was her advantage. They didn't know about Crow, about his resources, about his influence. They didn't know that she was no longer alone, that she had a powerful, albeit dangerous, ally. But the knowledge was a double-edged sword. It gave her strength, confidence, but it also came with a price. The price of secrecy, the cost of trust, the constant fear of exposure. One evening, as she sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jed came to sit beside her. "You seem different, Belle," he said, his voice low, his gaze searching. "Stronger." Belle hesitated, unsure how to respond. She couldn't tell him the truth, not yet. I'm just trying to keep going, Jed, she said, her voice evasive. For Thomas. For the ranch. He nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of understanding and something else. Something that looked almost like concern. Just be careful, Belle, he said, his voice a low, warning murmur. There are things happening in this territory. Things you need to be aware of. Belle's heart skipped a beat. What did he know? What had he heard? Before she could ask, a rider appeared on the horizon, a dark silhouette against the fading light. Belle's hand instinctively went to the Winchester rifle leaning against the porch railing. It wasn't Crow. It was someone else. Someone she hadn't seen in years. Someone she'd hoped never to see again. Sheriff Abernathy rode toward the house, the weariness clear in his posture. He reined in before the porch and looked up at Belle, his expression grim. He seemed older, the lines on his face deepening. Belle, the sheriff said, his tone grave, we need to talk. The sound of his voice was like a cold wind blowing across the prairie. Chapter 7. Scars Beneath the Surface. Abernathy's visit was unsettling, a disruption of the fragile equilibrium Belle had managed to establish. He dismounted slowly, his movements stiff and heavy, the weight of his years and his responsibilities evident in every gesture. He tied his horse to the hitching post, the leather creaking softly, a sound that seemed to amplify the silence that hung between them. Belle invited him onto the porch, offering him a cup of coffee, a gesture of hospitality that felt strained and awkward under the circumstances. He accepted, his eyes, tired and bloodshot, studying her with a mixture of concern and something else. Something that looked almost like suspicion. They sat on the porch swing, the same swing where she'd sat with Crow, the same swing where she'd sat with Thomas, countless times, sharing their dreams, their hopes, their fears. The wood creaked beneath their weight, a mournful sound that echoed the unspoken tension between them. I heard you had some visitors, Abernathy said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He was referring to the neighboring ranchers, the ones who had been circling like vultures, waiting for her to fail. Word travels fast in these parts, Belle replied, her voice noncommittal. He took a sip of his coffee, the steam swirling around his face, obscuring his expression for a moment. Too fast, he muttered, more to himself than to her. What brings you out here, Sheriff? Belle asked, her voice steady, despite the unease that was churning in her gut. He looked at her then, his eyes, those tired, bloodshot eyes, searching hers. There's been talk, Belle, he said, his voice low, hesitant. Rumors. Belle's heart skipped a beat. Rumors about what? About Crow? About the ranch? About her? What kind of rumors? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. He hesitated, as if unsure how to proceed. Rumors about your husband's death, he said, finally, the words hanging heavy in the air. Belle felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Thomas's death. 5 years ago. She'd thought she'd put it behind her, that she'd come to terms with the loss, the grief, the injustice. But the wound was still there, raw and sensitive, easily reopened. What about it? She asked, her voice trembling slightly, despite her efforts to control it. There are some who say it wasn't an ambush, Abernathy said, his voice low, his gaze unwavering. That it was something else. Belle stared at him, her mind reeling. Something else? What did he mean? What were they saying? They're saying he was murdered, Abernathy said, his voice barely a whisper. By someone he knew. Someone he trusted. The words hit Belle like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. Murdered? By someone he knew? It was unthinkable, unbelievable. Who? She asked, her voice a choked whisper. Who would say such a thing? Abernathy hesitated again, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and something else. Something that looked almost like accusation. They're saying it was you, Belle, he said, his voice heavy with regret. That you arranged it. Belle gasped, recoiling as if he'd struck her. Me? She exclaimed, her voice rising in disbelief and outrage. That's absurd. Why would I? They say you were having an affair, Abernathy continued, his voice relentless, his gaze unwavering. With another man. A gambler. The words hung in the air, a poisonous cloud, suffocating her. A gambler. Crow. The rumors had reached Abernathy, twisted and distorted, poisoned by malice and suspicion. Belle felt a surge of anger, of indignation, of betrayal. How could they believe such a thing? How could they accuse her of such a heinous crime? That's a lie, she exclaimed, her voice trembling with fury. I loved Thomas. I would never. I know, Belle, Abernathy said, his voice softening, his eyes filled with a flicker of compassion. I know you loved him. But what? Belle demanded, her voice sharp, her gaze unwavering. He sighed, a weary, defeated sound. But there's evidence, he said, his voice low, his gaze dropping to his hands. Circumstantial, maybe, but enough to raise doubts. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. Belle recognized it instantly. It was hers. She'd given it to Thomas, years ago, a token of her love. We found this near his body, Abernathy said, his voice heavy with sadness. It had a lock of hair inside. Your hair. Belle stared at the locket, her mind reeling. Her hair. In Thomas's locket. Near his body. It didn't make sense. She'd given him the locket years ago, but she hadn't seen it and she couldn't remember. I don't understand, she stammered, her voice trembling. I don't remember. Abernathy looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Someone planted it, Belle, he said, his voice low, his gaze unwavering. Someone wanted to make it look like you were involved.
Someone. Crow?
Was it possible? Had he orchestrated this, too? Had he manipulated events, not only to gain control of the ranch, but to frame her for Thomas's murder? The thought was horrifying, unthinkable. But it was also, Belle realized with a sickening jolt of understanding, entirely plausible. She looked at Abernathy, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She was trapped, caught in a web of lies, deceit, and suspicion. And she had no idea how to escape. As the sheriff looked back at her, studying her every movement, she understood the scars he carried, the weight of justice in a lawless land. But more, she understood the scars she herself bore, unseen, beneath the surface. He watched her, and she wondered if he could see them, too. The silence stretched, and the wind carried a mournful song. Chapter 8. A storm brewing on the horizon. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, a dark cloud threatening to engulf Belle in a storm of suspicion and doubt. She stared at Abernathy, her mind reeling, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wanted to scream, to deny the accusations, to lash out at the injustice of it all. But she knew she had to remain calm, to control her emotions, to think clearly. I didn't kill Thomas, she said, her voice low, but firm, her gaze unwavering. I loved him. I would never have hurt him. Abernathy sighed, his weary eyes studying her, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of guilt. I want to believe you, Belle, he said, his voice heavy with regret. I do. But the evidence, it's not good. He explained the rumors that had been circulating, the whispers that had reached his ears, fueled by the malicious gossip of the neighboring ranchers, eager to see her fail, to see the ranch fall into their hands. They painted a picture of a desperate woman, trapped in a loveless marriage, seeking solace in the arms of a dangerous gambler. They'd twisted the truth, distorted the facts, creating a narrative that was both compelling and damning. The locket, of course, was the most damaging piece of evidence. It was a tangible link between her and Thomas's death, a seemingly irrefutable proof of her guilt. Belle tried to explain, to tell Abernathy that she hadn't seen the locket in years, that she had no idea how it had ended up near Thomas's body. But her explanations sounded weak, even to her own ears. Someone planted it, Sheriff, she insisted, her voice pleading. Someone wanted to frame me. Abernathy nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mixture of doubt and something else. Something that looked almost like hope. That's what I'm thinking, Belle, he said, his voice low, his gaze unwavering. But who?
And why?
The obvious answer, of course, was Crow. He had the motive, the opportunity, the means. He'd wanted the ranch, and he'd been willing to do anything to get it. Framing her for Thomas's murder would have been the perfect way to achieve his goal, to eliminate any obstacles, to secure his control. But Belle couldn't tell Abernathy that. She couldn't reveal Crow's involvement, not without jeopardizing the fragile partnership they'd forged, not without risking everything she'd worked so hard to rebuild. I don't know, she said, her voice evasive, her gaze dropping to her hands. I can't think of anyone who would want to hurt me like this. It was a lie, of course. But it was a necessary lie, a lie she had to tell to protect herself, to protect the ranch, to protect the fragile hope that flickered within her. Abernathy studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching, probing. He was a good man, a just man, but he was also a lawman, bound by duty, by evidence, by the need to find the truth. I'm not arresting you, Belle, he said, finally, his voice heavy with reluctance.
Not yet.
But I'm not letting this go, either. I'm going to investigate. I'm going to find out who killed Thomas and why. He stood up, his movements stiff and slow, the weight of his responsibilities evident in every gesture. He looked down at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and determination. Be careful, Belle, he said, his voice a low, warning murmur. Whoever did this, they're still out there, and they might not be finished. He mounted his horse, the leather creaking softly, a sound that seemed to amplify the silence that followed. He rode off slowly, disappearing into the gathering dusk, leaving Belle alone on the porch, the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, a sense of impending doom settling upon her. She watched him go, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She was trapped, caught in a web of deceit, suspicion, and danger. She had no one to turn to, no one she could trust. Except, perhaps, the very man who might be responsible for it all. She thought of Crow, of his cold calculation, his ruthless ambition, his unsettling charm. He was a dangerous man, a man who lived by his own rules, a man who could offer her salvation or damnation. She had no choice to make. She sat and stared as the clouds rolled in. As the storm built, she realized that she would have to confront Crow, to demand answers, to find out the truth, no matter how painful, how dangerous it might be. The wind picked up, whipping her hair around her face, the first drops of rain beginning to fall, a cold, stinging reminder of the storm that was brewing, both outside and within her. It was a storm that threatened to consume her, to destroy everything she held dear. But she wouldn't surrender. She would fight. She would survive. The ranch stood silent, and she could hear the distant rumble of thunder. Chapter 9. The Devil's Bargain Revisited. The storm broke with a fury that mirrored the turmoil in Belle's heart. Rain lashed against the windows of the old house, thunder rattled the timbers, and lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, stark flashes, revealing the wind-whipped trees and the rain-swept plains. It was a night for huddling indoors, for seeking shelter from the elements. But Belle couldn't rest. She couldn't find peace. She paced the floor of the living room, her boots echoing on the worn wooden planks, her mind racing, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear, anger, and a desperate need for answers. She had to see Crow. She had to confront him, to demand an explanation, to find out the truth, no matter how painful, how dangerous it might be. But she couldn't go to him. Not yet. It was too risky. Abernathy was watching her, suspecting her, and if she were seen meeting with Crow, it would only confirm his suspicions, strengthen his case against her. She had to be patient, to wait for the right opportunity, to choose her moment carefully. She spent the night tossing and turning, her sleep fitful and disturbed by nightmares, by visions of Thomas, his face pale and lifeless, his eyes accusing. She woke before dawn, exhausted and unrefreshed, the storm still raging outside, the wind howling like a banshee, the rain drumming against the roof like a relentless drumbeat. She made coffee, the strong, bitter brew a familiar comfort in the pre-dawn gloom. She sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window, watching the storm, her thoughts consumed by Crow, by the accusations, by the evidence that seemed to point to her guilt. She had to find a way to clear her name, to prove her innocence, to find the real killer.
But how?
She had no leads, no clues, no one she could trust. Except, perhaps, the very man who might be responsible for it all. It was a gamble, a dangerous gamble, but it was one she was willing to take. She had nothing left to lose. As the day wore on, the storm began to subside, the wind dying down, the rain softening to a drizzle. Belle knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to see Crow. She had to find out the truth. She saddled her horse, a sturdy mare named Bess, the animal snorting and pawing the ground, sensing her rider's unease. She rode out, heading towards redemption, towards the Golden Nugget Saloon, towards the place where it had all begun, where she'd made the fateful bargain that had led her to this point. The town was quiet, subdued, the streets muddy and deserted, the saloons and shops closed and shuttered. The storm had driven everyone indoors, seeking shelter from the elements, from the lingering tension that hung in the air. Belle tied Bess to the hitching post in front of the Golden Nugget, the familiar creak of the leather a reminder of countless other visits, of happier times, of a life that had been shattered by loss and betrayal. She entered the saloon, the swinging doors creaking open with a mournful sound, the interior dim and deserted, the air thick with the scent of stale beer and smoke. The only occupant was the bartender, a burly man with a scarred face and a wary expression, polishing glasses behind the long, wooden bar. He looked up as she entered, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, his voice gruff, his gaze guarded. "I'm looking for Crow," Belle said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. The bartender hesitated, his eyes flicking towards the back room, the same room where she'd played cards with Crow, where she'd lost everything. "He's not here," he said, his voice evasive, his gaze avoiding hers. Belle knew he was lying. She could see it in his eyes, in his body language, in the subtle shift in his demeanor. "Don't lie to me," she said, her voice low, but firm. "I know he's here. I need to see him." The bartender hesitated again, then sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "He's in the back," he said, his voice resigned. "But he's not expecting you." Belle nodded, her heart pounding. She walked towards the back room, her boots echoing on the wooden floor, the silence amplifying her apprehension, her fear, her determination. She pushed open the door, the hinges creaking softly, the room dim and smoky, the air thick with the scent of whiskey and cigars. Crow was sitting at the same table where they'd played cards 5 years ago, dealing a deck of cards with a practiced flick of his wrist. He looked up as she entered, his blue eyes, sharp and assessing, narrowing in surprise. He hadn't expected her. He hadn't anticipated her arrival. "Belle," he said, his voice smooth, his expression unreadable. "What a surprise." "We need to talk, Crow," Belle said, her voice trembling slightly, despite her efforts to control it. He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach his eyes.
"I figured we would," he said.
He gestured to the chair opposite him, the one she had occupied 5 years before. Belle crossed to the chair that had been the instrument of her ruin before and sat down, facing him. The air thickened between them, heavy with the unspoken, and a storm of memory. Chapter 10. Whispers of Betrayal and Redemption. The air in the back room of the Golden Nugget crackled with unspoken tension, a silent battle of wills between Belle and Cass Crow. The smoky haze, the dim light, the scent of whiskey and cigars, it all brought back a flood of memories of that fateful night 5 years ago, when she'd gambled away her future, her happiness, her life. "You know why I'm here," Belle said, her voice low, but firm, her gaze unwavering. She wouldn't flinch. She wouldn't show him any weakness.
"Not this time."
Crow leaned back in his chair, his blue eyes, sharp and assessing, studying her, searching for any sign of fear, any hint of vulnerability. He was a predator, patient and confident, and she was his prey, cornered and desperate. But she wasn't the same woman he'd faced 5 years ago. She was stronger now, hardened by grief, by loss, by the relentless struggle to survive. "I have a pretty good idea," he replied, his voice smooth, his expression unreadable. He gestured towards the deck of cards on the table. "Care for a game?" Belle ignored the offer, her gaze fixed on his. "They're saying I killed him, Crow," she said, her voice trembling slightly, despite her efforts to control it. "They're saying I murdered Thomas." The words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory, a dark cloud threatening to engulf her in a storm of suspicion and doubt. Crow didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. He simply sat there, watching her, his eyes unreadable. "And do you believe that, Belle?" he asked, his voice soft, almost gentle. "I don't know what to believe," Belle replied, her voice a choked whisper. "But the evidence it points to me." She told him about Abernathy's visit, about the rumors, about the locket, about the circumstantial evidence that seemed to confirm her guilt. She told him about her fear, her desperation, her growing suspicion that he might be involved, that he might have orchestrated the whole thing. Crow listened intently, his expression unchanging, his eyes revealing nothing. When she finished, he leaned forward, his gaze locking with hers. "You think I killed your husband?" he asked, his voice low, intense.
Belle hésitait.
She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to believe that the man who had offered her a chance at redemption, a chance to rebuild her life, could be capable of such a heinous crime. But the evidence, the suspicion, it was all too compelling.
"Did you?"
she asked, her voice trembling, her gaze searching his. Crow smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I told you before, Belle," he said, his voice smooth, his gaze unwavering. "I'm a gambler, not a killer." "But you profit from death," Belle countered, her voice sharp, her gaze accusing. "You profit from other people's misfortune." "I play the hand I'm dealt," Crow replied, his voice losing some of its smoothness. "I don't create the circumstances. I simply exploit them." "And Thomas's death, was that just another circumstance?" Belle asked, her voice laced with bitterness, with anger, with a growing sense of betrayal. Crow hesitated, his eyes flickering for a moment, revealing a hint of something. Something that looked almost like regret. "His death was unfortunate," he said, his voice low, his gaze dropping to his hands. "But it wasn't my doing." "But you knew," Belle said, her voice rising, her anger flaring. "You knew about the rumors, about the accusations. You knew they were pointing the finger at me." Crow nodded slowly. "I heard whispers," he admitted, his voice guarded. "And you did nothing?" Belle exclaimed, her voice incredulous. "You let them suspect me? You let them accuse me?" "I'm not the sheriff, Belle," Crow replied, his voice defensive. "It's not my job to investigate murders. It's not my job to protect you. But you're my partner," Belle cried, her voice filled with despair, with a sense of betrayal. "We made a bargain. We're supposed to be in this together." Crow leaned back in his chair, his eyes, those unsettling blue eyes, studying her, assessing her. "We made a business arrangement, Belle," he said, his voice cold, his gaze unwavering. "Not a marriage vow." The words stung, a sharp reminder of the nature of their relationship, of the cold, calculating reality of their partnership. It was a business arrangement, nothing more. He owed her nothing. He had no obligation to protect her, to defend her, to help her. But then something shifted. A flicker of something other than cold calculation crossed his face. It might have been compassion, or perhaps just a pragmatic assessment of the situation. But he continued, his voice softening, losing some of its hard edge. "I don't like loose ends. And I don't like being manipulated." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to Belle. "What's this?" Belle asked, her voice suspicious. "It's a letter," Crow replied, his voice low, his gaze intense. "From your husband. Written a few days before he died." He rose from the table, looking down at her, a strange light in his eyes. "Read it, Belle. It might shed some light on things." She stared at him, took the offered letter, and opened it with trembling hands. The air was utterly still, and the silence, thick. Chapter 11. The Unforgiving Glare of Truth. Belle unfolded the letter with trembling hands, her heart pounding in her chest, a mixture of dread and anticipation swirling within her. The paper was thin and worn, the ink faded, the handwriting unmistakably Thomas's, a familiar script that brought a fresh wave of grief, a sharp pang of loss. She began to read, her eyes scanning the words, her mind struggling to comprehend their meaning. The letter was addressed to her, filled with Thomas's love, his concern, his fears. He wrote about the rustlers, about his pursuit, about his growing suspicion that he was being followed, that he was walking into a trap. He wrote about his love for her, his regret for the hardships she'd endured, his hope for a better future, a future they would build together, on the ranch, under the vast, open sky of the frontier. And then, towards the end, he wrote about something else, something that made Belle's blood run cold, something that shattered her world, her beliefs, her understanding of everything she thought she knew. He wrote about a betrayal. Not hers. His. He wrote about a secret, a dark secret he'd kept hidden for years, a secret that had come back to haunt him, a secret that was now threatening his life, her life, their future. He wrote about a debt, a gambling debt, a debt he'd incurred years ago, before he'd met her, a debt he'd never been able to repay. A debt to a man named Silas Thorne. Belle gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes widening in disbelief, in horror. Silas Thorne. She knew the name. He was a notorious outlaw, a ruthless killer, a man who lived by his own rules, a man who had a reputation for collecting his debts, no matter the cost. He was Crow's enemy. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, a horrifying picture emerging from the fragments of truth, the whispers of betrayal, the circumstantial evidence that had pointed to her guilt. Thomas hadn't been killed by rustlers. He'd been murdered by Silas Thorne, or by someone working for him, to settle an old debt, a debt that had nothing to do with her, a debt that had been hidden from her, a secret that had ultimately cost him his life. And Crow hadn't killed Thomas. But he'd known. He'd known about the debt, about the threat, about the danger. He'd used it, manipulated it, exploited it to his own advantage. He'd let her believe she was responsible, let her suffer the guilt, the suspicion, the accusations. He'd used her grief, her vulnerability, her desperation to gain control of the ranch, to further his own agenda. Belle looked up at Crow, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and a profound sense of loss. "You knew," she said, her voice a choked whisper, her gaze accusing. "You knew all along." Crow didn't deny it. He simply stood there, watching her, his eyes unreadable. "I suspected," he admitted, his voice low, his gaze unwavering. "I didn't know for sure. Not until I found this letter." "And when was that?" Belle demanded, her voice rising, her anger flaring. "A few days ago," Crow replied, his voice guarded. "After Abernathy came to see you. I started investigating." "Investigating?" Belle exclaimed, her voice incredulous. "You let me believe I was responsible. You let me suffer." "I had to be sure," Crow said, his voice defensive. "I had to know the truth. And I had to protect my investment." "Your investment?" Belle cried, her voice filled with despair, with a sense of betrayal. "Is that all I am to you? An investment?" Crow hesitated, his eyes flickering for a moment, revealing a hint of something. Something that looked almost like regret. "You're more than that, Belle," he said, his voice softening, losing some of its hard edge. "But I can't afford to be sentimental. Not in this world." "But you could have told me," Belle said, her voice pleading, her gaze searching his. "You could have warned me." "And risk scaring off Thorne?" Crow countered, his voice sharp. "He's the key, Belle. He's the one who killed your husband. And he's the one who's going to pay." Crow's words, his sudden shift from cold indifference to a promise of vengeance, gave Belle a glimmer of hope, a flicker of understanding. He wasn't just protecting his investment, he was seeking justice, his own twisted, brutal form of justice. Belle looked down at the letter again, her gaze lingering on the name, Silas Thorne. She knew the path forward. He looked up at Crow, his blue eyes alight. "We're going to find him," she declared to Crow. The words, not the beginning, but the start of an alliance. The wind had died down, and the sun was beginning to break through the clouds, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare on the truth that had been revealed. Chapter 12. Riding through the Valley of Regret. The decision to confront Silas Thorne was made, a pact sealed not with a handshake or a contract, but with a shared look of determination, a silent understanding forged in the crucible of betrayal and loss. Belle and Crow, unlikely allies, bound together by a common enemy, a shared thirst for justice, and a tangled web of secrets and lies. They left the Golden Nugget, the echoes of the past swirling around them, the weight of their decisions settling upon their shoulders. The town of redemption seemed to hold its breath, the muddy streets deserted, the saloons and shops silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. They rode out of town, heading towards the rugged, unforgiving landscape that stretched beyond the town's limits, a vast expanse of mesas, canyons, and desolate plains, a land where danger lurked around every corner, where survival depended on wits, courage, and a healthy dose of luck. Belle rode Bess, her sturdy mare, the familiar rhythm of the horse's gait a source of comfort in the midst of the turmoil. Crow rode his chestnut stallion, the animal's powerful strides eating up the ground, a reflection of its rider's restless energy, his relentless pursuit of his goals. They rode in silence, for the most part, the only sounds the creak of leather, the thud of hooves, the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. They were both lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the implications of their decision, the risks involved, the potential consequences. Belle was thinking of Thomas, of his love, his betrayal, his tragic death. She was thinking of the years she'd spent grieving, the guilt she'd carried, the accusations she'd endured. She was thinking of the injustice of it all, the need for retribution, the burning desire to see Silas Thorne pay for his crimes. She was also thinking of Crow, of his complex nature, his ruthless ambition, his unsettling charm. He was a dangerous man, a man who lived by his own rules, a man who could offer her salvation or damnation. She didn't trust him, not entirely, but she needed him. He had the knowledge, the connections, the skills to find Thorne, to bring him to justice. Crow, in turn, was thinking of his own past, of the choices he'd made, the paths he'd taken, the enemies he'd accumulated. He was thinking of Silas Thorne, of their long-standing rivalry, their bitter feud, their inevitable confrontation. He was thinking of the danger that lay ahead, the risks involved, the potential for violence, for bloodshed. He was also thinking of Belle, of her strength, her resilience, her unexpected vulnerability. He'd underestimated her, he realized, just as he'd underestimated Thomas. He'd seen her as a pawn in his game, a means to an end, a tool to be used and discarded.
But she was more than that.
She was a force to be reckoned with, a woman who had faced adversity and loss and had somehow managed to keep going. He admired her, he realized, with a grudging respect that surprised even himself. He admired her courage, her determination, her unwavering loyalty to her husband, to her ranch, to her values. As they rode, the landscape changed, the gentle slopes giving way to steep canyons, the open plains narrowing into winding trails, the vegetation becoming sparse and rugged, a reflection of the harsh realities of life on the frontier. They stopped for the night, making camp in a sheltered cove, beneath a towering mesa, the stars scattered across the vast, inky canvas of the night sky, a silent witness to their journey. They built a fire, the flames crackling and snapping, casting a warm, flickering glow on their faces, illuminating their expressions, their unspoken emotions. They ate a simple meal of beans and jerky, the silence stretching between them, punctuated only by the crackling fire, the distant howl of a coyote. "Why didn't you tell me?" Belle asked, finally breaking the silence, her voice low, her gaze fixed on the flames. She was referring to the letter, to Thomas's debt, to Thorne's involvement. Crow hesitated, his eyes flickering, revealing a hint of something. something that looked almost like shame. "I told you," he said, his voice defensive. "I had to be sure. And I had to protect my investment." "And what about me?" Belle asked, her voice rising, her anger flaring. "What about protecting me?" Crow looked at her, his blue eyes, sharp and assessing, searching hers. "I did what I thought was best," he said, his voice softening, losing some of its hard edge. "For both of us." "Best for you, you mean?" Belle countered, her voice laced with bitterness. Crow sighed, his shoulders slumping, a rare display of vulnerability. "Maybe," he admitted, his voice low, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I'm not a good man, Belle. I've never pretended to be. But I'm not the villain you think I am." Belle studied him, her gaze searching, probing. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, to see him as something other than a cold, calculating gambler. But the past, the betrayals, the secrets, they cast a long shadow, obscuring the truth, making it difficult to discern his true motives, his true feelings. She looked up at the starry expanse of the night and wondered, not for the first time, if there was anyone she could truly trust. She thought of Thomas and knew, with a sickening jolt, that the valley they rode through was not just the landscape around them, but also the journey they were taking through their own regrets. As they stared into the flames, they knew they had to sleep, but the rest would be incomplete and unfulfilling. Chapter 13. A Dance with Danger and Desire. The journey to find Silas Thorne was fraught with peril, a constant dance with danger, a test of their resilience, their courage, their fragile alliance. They rode through treacherous terrain, across vast, desolate plains, over rugged mountains, through winding canyons, the landscape a reflection of the challenges they faced, the obstacles they had to overcome. They encountered hostile Native American tribes, wary of outsiders, their presence a reminder of the ongoing conflict between settlers and the indigenous people, a conflict fueled by greed, by broken treaties, by the relentless encroachment of civilization upon their ancestral lands. They crossed paths with outlaws, bandits, and drifters, men who lived by their own rules, who preyed on the weak, who survived by violence and intimidation. They had to be constantly vigilant, constantly on guard, their hands never far from their weapons, their senses alert to any sign of danger. But the greatest danger, Belle realized, came not from external threats, but from within. It came from the simmering tension between her and Crow, the unspoken attraction, the forbidden desire that flickered beneath the surface of their uneasy partnership. They were drawn to each other, despite their differences, despite their past, despite the circumstances that had brought them together. It was a dangerous attraction, a forbidden desire, a temptation that threatened to consume them, to derail their mission, to destroy everything they were working towards. Belle found herself drawn to Crow's strength, his confidence, his unwavering determination. She admired his resilience, his ability to survive in this harsh, unforgiving world. She was intrigued by his complexity, his hidden depths, the glimpses of vulnerability that occasionally peeked through his carefully constructed facade. She also found herself physically attracted to him, to his rugged masculinity, his lean, muscular physique, his piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through her, to the core of her being. It was an attraction she fought against, an attraction she tried to deny, but it was there, undeniable, a constant source of temptation, a constant reminder of the forbidden nature of their relationship. Crow, in turn, found himself drawn to Belle's strength, her resilience, her unexpected vulnerability. He admired her courage, her determination, her unwavering loyalty to her husband, to her ranch, to her values. He was intrigued by her intelligence, her sharp wit, her ability to hold her own in a man's world. He also found himself physically attracted to her quiet beauty, her weathered hands, her eyes that reflected the vastness of the sky, the loneliness of the frontier. It was an attraction he tried to suppress, an attraction he knew was dangerous, but it was there, undeniable, a constant source of conflict, a constant reminder of the boundaries he couldn't cross. They danced around each other, their interactions filled with unspoken tension, with subtle gestures, with fleeting glances that spoke volumes. They shared moments of intimacy, moments of vulnerability, moments when the walls between them seemed to crumble, when the forbidden desire threatened to overwhelm them. One evening, as they sat by the campfire, sharing a meager meal, their conversation drifted towards personal matters, towards their past, their regrets, their lost loves. "You never remarried," Crow said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the flames. He was referring to Belle, to the years she'd spent alone, grieving for Thomas. Belle hesitated, her heart aching with the memory of her lost love. "There was no one like him," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Crow nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of understanding and something else. Something that looked almost like jealousy. "He was a lucky man," he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. Belle looked at him, her eyes searching his. "And you?" she asked, her voice curious. "Have you ever loved?" Crow hesitated, his eyes flickering, revealing a hint of pain, a glimpse of a past he'd tried to bury. "Once," he said, his voice low, his gaze dropping to his hands. "A long time ago. It didn't end well." Belle sensed a story there, a story of heartbreak, of loss, of betrayal. She wanted to ask him about it, to learn more about his past, to understand the forces that had shaped him, that had made him the man he was. But she didn't. She knew it was too dangerous, too intimate, too close to crossing the line that separated them. As the days passed, the tension between them grew, the unspoken attraction becoming more intense, more difficult to ignore. They were walking a tightrope, balancing between their shared mission and their forbidden desire, between their need for each other and the danger of their attraction. The air crackled, and it felt as if the very landscape held its breath, waiting. Chapter 14. The Cold Embrace of Loneliness. The closer they got to Silas Thorne, the more palpable the tension became, a suffocating blanket woven from fear, anticipation, and the unspoken desires that simmered between Belle and Crow. The landscape mirrored their internal turmoil, growing harsher, more desolate, the towering mesas and deep canyons casting long, ominous shadows. They found signs of Thorne's passage, abandoned campsites, the tracks of horses and men, the lingering scent of smoke and gunpowder. He was close, they knew, and the knowledge sent a shiver of both dread and excitement down Belle's spine. One evening, they made camp in a narrow canyon, the walls rising high above them, the sky a sliver of twilight blue between the towering rock formations. They were exhausted, both physically and emotionally, the strain of their journey, the constant vigilance, the unspoken tension taking its toll. They built a fire, the flames crackling and snapping, casting a flickering, unsteady light on their faces, illuminating the lines of fatigue, the worry etched into their features. They ate in silence, the usual camaraderie absent, replaced by a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. Belle found herself acutely aware of Crow's presence, of his physical proximity, of the way his eyes seemed to linger on her, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken attraction that simmered between them. It was an attraction she fought against, an attraction she tried to deny, but it was there, undeniable, a constant source of temptation, a constant reminder of the forbidden nature of their relationship. After they finished eating, Crow rose and walked to the edge of the canyon, his back to her, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. Belle watched him, her heart aching with a mixture of longing and despair. She wanted to reach out to him, to bridge the gap that separated them, to find solace in his arms, to forget, for a brief moment, the danger, the fear, the relentless loneliness that had haunted her for so long. But she couldn't. She knew it was too risky, too dangerous, too close to crossing the line that separated them, the line between partnership and something more, something forbidden, something that could destroy everything they were working towards. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill that seeped into her bones, a chill that came not from the evening air, but from the cold, hard reality of her situation, of her isolation, of the loneliness that had become her constant companion. Crow turned, his face shadowed in the darkness, his eyes unreadable. He looked at her, his gaze searching, probing, as if trying to decipher her thoughts, her emotions, her unspoken desires. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice low, his tone devoid of any emotion. Belle nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. She knew he was right. She needed to rest, to gather her strength, to prepare for the confrontation that lay ahead. But she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, wrapped in her bedroll, staring up at the sliver of sky visible between the canyon walls, the stars scattered across the vast, inky canvas, a silent witness to her turmoil, her loneliness, her forbidden desires. She thought of Thomas, of his love, his warmth, his unwavering presence in her life. She thought of the years they'd spent together, the dreams they'd shared, the hardships they'd endured. She thought of the emptiness that had filled her life since his death, the void that nothing seemed to fill, the aching loneliness that had become her constant companion. She thought of Crow, of his strength, his confidence, his unsettling charm. She thought of the forbidden attraction that simmered between them, the temptation that threatened to consume them, to derail their mission, to destroy everything they were working towards. She knew she was playing with fire, that she was risking everything by allowing herself to feel anything for him. But she couldn't help it. She was drawn to him, despite her better judgment, despite the danger, despite the knowledge that it could only lead to heartbreak, to more pain, to more loss. As the night wore on, the silence deepened, the loneliness intensified, the cold embrace of the canyon walls a stark reminder of her isolation, of her vulnerability, of the precariousness of her situation. She felt utterly alone, adrift in a sea of uncertainty, of fear, of forbidden desires. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the world, to find some solace in sleep, but it was no use. The images, the thoughts, the emotions continued to swirl within her, relentless torment that offered no escape. The wind whispered through the canyon, a lonely sound that echoed the emptiness in her heart. It was a sound that made her think of all the things she had lost and might yet still lose. Chapter 15. Letters from a Ghost. Promises from the Living. The next morning dawned cold and gray, the sky overcast, the air heavy with a sense of impending doom. Belle and Crow broke camp quickly, their movements efficient, their conversation minimal. They were both preoccupied, their thoughts focused on the task ahead, on the confrontation with Silas Thorne that was now inevitable. As they rode, Belle found herself thinking about the letter from Thomas, the one Crow had given her, the one that had revealed the truth about his death, about the debt, about Thorne's involvement. It was a letter that had shattered her world, her beliefs, her understanding of everything she thought she knew. But it was also a letter that had given her a purpose, a reason to fight, a reason to seek justice, to avenge Thomas's death, to reclaim her life, her future. She pulled the letter from her saddlebag, the paper worn and creased from repeated readings, the ink faded, the words a constant reminder of the past, of the betrayal, of the loss. She read it again, her eyes scanning the familiar script, her heart aching with a mixture of grief and anger. She noticed something she hadn't noticed before, a small, almost imperceptible inscription on the back of the envelope, a single word, barely legible, redemption. Belle frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. What did it mean? Was it a message? A clue? A reference to the town where she'd first met Crow, where she'd gambled away her future. She showed the letter to Crow, pointing out the inscription. He examined it, his eyes narrowing in concentration. It's a code, he said, his voice low, his gaze thoughtful. A message of some kind. But what does it mean? Belle asked, her voice frustrated, her mind racing. Crow hesitated, his eyes flickering, revealing a hint of something. Something that looked almost like understanding. It's a reference to a place, he said, his voice guarded. A place where Thorne operates. Where? Belle demanded, her voice urgent, her heart pounding. Crow hesitated again, his eyes searching hers. It's a ghost town, he said, his voice low, his gaze unwavering. North of here. Called Redemption's End. Redemption's End. The name sent a shiver down Belle's spine. It sounded ominous, foreboding, a place of death, of despair, of lost hopes. "We need to go there," Belle said, her voice determined, her gaze unwavering. Crow nodded. "I know," he said, his voice grim. "But it's dangerous, Belle. Thorn will have men there. It'll be a trap." "I don't care," Belle said, her voice fierce, her eyes flashing. "I'm not afraid. I want justice. I want revenge." Crow looked at her, his blue eyes, sharp and assessing, searching hers. He saw the determination, the anger, the grief, the unwavering resolve that burned within her. He saw the woman she was, the strength she possessed, the courage she had found in the face of adversity, of loss, of betrayal. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers calloused but surprisingly gentle. Belle flinched at his touch, a mixture of surprise and a strange, unsettling awareness of his physical presence. "We'll do it together," he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. "We'll face him together." It was a promise, a commitment, a vow. It was a moment of connection, of understanding, of shared purpose. It was a moment that transcended their differences, their past, their forbidden desires. It was also a moment that was interrupted by the sound of gunfire, a sharp, sudden crack that echoed through the canyons, a stark reminder of the danger that lay ahead, of the confrontation that awaited them. They spurred their horses, racing towards the sound, their hearts pounding, their adrenaline surging, their minds focused on the task ahead, on the promise they had made, on the ghost town that awaited them. The sound of hooves was loud, and dust billowed, but they did not slow. As they rode, a second letter came to Belle's mind. This was an unsent letter she had once composed in her mind, but had never dared write. It was a letter to the phantom of Silas Thorn, and in the privacy of her mind, she allowed its words to surface now. "Thorn," the letter began, "you took from me the most precious thing I had. You cast a shadow, and I mistook it for my own. You think yourself clever, but you're a coward. You hide in ghost towns and send others to do your bidding. You will not hide from me." The letter ended there in her mind, and it had no signature. But as Belle drew closer to Thorn, she knew this mental correspondence was merely the prelude to a very real, very physical confrontation. Chapter 16. The Reckoning at Rattlesnake Ridge. Redemption's End was aptly named. It was a ghost town, a desolate collection of crumbling buildings, abandoned shacks, and decaying structures, a testament to broken dreams, lost hopes, and the relentless march of time. The wind whistled through the empty streets, carrying the scent of dust, decay, and the lingering echoes of a past that refused to die. They approached cautiously, their horses' hooves muffled by the soft sand, their senses alert to any sign of danger. The town seemed deserted, eerily silent, the only sounds the creaking of weathered wood, the flapping of loose shutters, the mournful cry of the wind. But Belle knew Thorn was there. She could feel it in her bones, a sense of dread, of anticipation, of impending confrontation. He was waiting for them, lurking in the shadows, his men hidden among the crumbling buildings, their weapons trained on the empty streets. They dismounted, tying their horses to a weathered hitching post in front of what had once been the town's saloon, the Last Chance Saloon, a name that seemed both ironic and prophetic. The building was a dilapidated structure, its windows boarded up, its doors hanging precariously on their hinges, its sign faded and barely legible. Crow drew his Colt Peacemaker, the steel gleaming in the dim light, his movements smooth, practiced, his eyes scanning the surrounding buildings, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. Belle followed suit, drawing the Winchester rifle she'd carried since Thomas's death, the weapon feeling heavy and familiar in her hands, a symbol of her resolve, her determination, her thirst for justice. "Stay close," Crow said, his voice low, his gaze unwavering. "And be ready for anything." Belle nodded, her heart pounding, her adrenaline surging, her senses heightened. She was afraid, yes, but she was also determined. She wouldn't back down. She wouldn't be intimidated. She would face Thorn, and she would make him pay for his crimes. They moved slowly, cautiously, through the empty streets, their footsteps echoing in the silence, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the dusty ground. They checked each building, each shack, each crumbling structure, their weapons raised, their fingers on the triggers, ready to fire at a moment's notice. They found nothing. The town seemed deserted, abandoned, a ghost of its former self. But Belle knew Thorn was there. He was playing a deadly game of cat and mouse, toying with them, testing them, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. They reached the center of the town, a small, dusty square, dominated by a crumbling courthouse, its windows broken, its doors hanging open, a symbol of the lawlessness, the injustice, the decay that had consumed this place. And then it happened. A shot rang out, the bullet whizzing past Belle's head, embedding itself in the wooden wall of the courthouse. They dove for cover, taking shelter behind a crumbling stone wall, their hearts pounding, their adrenaline surging. More shots followed, a hail of bullets coming from multiple directions, from the rooftops, from the windows, from the shadows. They were surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned.
Thorn!
Crow shouted, his voice echoing through the empty square. Show yourself. Face us like a man. A voice, cold and cruel, answered him, echoing from the rooftop of the courthouse. Welcome to Redemption's End, Crow, the voice said. I've been expecting you. It was Silas Thorn. Belle recognized the voice, the same voice she'd heard in her nightmares, the voice of the man who had murdered her husband, the man who had destroyed her life. You're a coward, Thorn, Belle shouted, her voice trembling with anger, with grief, with a burning desire for revenge. Come down here and face me. Thorn laughed, a chilling, mocking sound that sent shivers down Belle's spine. I'm afraid I have the advantage, Mrs. Monroe, he said. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of your league. We'll see about that, Crow said, his voice grim, his eyes scanning the rooftops, searching for Thorn's location. The gunfire continued, a relentless barrage of bullets, pinning them down, keeping them trapped behind the crumbling stone wall. They returned fire, their shots echoing through the empty square, but it was a futile effort. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition. Belle knew they were in trouble. They were trapped, cornered, facing a seemingly insurmountable enemy. They were going to die here, in this desolate ghost town, their quest for justice, their thirst for revenge, unfulfilled. She looked at Crow, his face grim, his eyes determined, his hand still gripping his Colt peacemaker. He was a dangerous man, a man who lived by his own rules, a man who had brought her to this point, to this deadly confrontation. But he was also the only one who stood between her and certain death. He was their last hope, their only chance. He saw her, she saw him. Crow nodded to her, the slightest dip of his chin. The bullets continued to fly around them, and the battle was joined in earnest. Chapter 17. Blood on the sand, tears in the dust. The gunfight at Redemption's End was a brutal, chaotic melee, a desperate struggle for survival against overwhelming odds. Belle and Crow, pinned down behind the crumbling stone wall, fought with the courage of desperation, their shots echoing through the deserted town, their determination fueled by a mixture of anger, grief, and a burning desire for justice. But Thorn's men were numerous, well-armed, and strategically positioned. They rained down a hail of bullets from the rooftops, from the windows, from the shadows, keeping Belle and Crow pinned down, making it impossible for them to advance, to escape, to even find a clear shot at Thorn. Belle felt a sharp, burning pain in her shoulder, a searing agony that made her gasp, her hand flying to the wound. She'd been hit. A bullet had grazed her flesh, tearing through her shirt, leaving a trail of blood. Crow saw her, his eyes widening in alarm.
Belle,
he shouted, his voice filled with concern. Are you all right? I'm fine, Belle lied, her voice strained, her teeth gritted against the pain. She couldn't afford to be weak, to be vulnerable. She had to keep fighting, to keep going for Thomas, for herself, for the fragile hope of survival. Crow returned fire, his shots precise and deadly, taking down 2 of Thorne's men, providing a brief respite from the relentless barrage of bullets. But it wasn't enough. They were still outnumbered, still outgunned, still trapped. "We need to move," Crow shouted, his voice urgent. "We can't stay here. We're sitting ducks."
He was right.
They had to find a way to escape, to find a better position, to turn the tide of the battle.
But how?
They were surrounded, pinned down, with no clear escape route. Crow scanned the surrounding buildings, his eyes searching for an opening, a weakness, a chance. He spotted a narrow alleyway between the courthouse and the saloon, a dark, shadowy passage that might offer a temporary escape, a chance to regroup, to reevaluate their strategy. "Follow me," he shouted, his voice decisive. He grabbed Belle's arm, pulling her with him, and they made a dash for the alleyway, bullets whizzing past them, kicking up dust and debris. They reached the alleyway, plunging into the darkness, the shadows offering a temporary reprieve from the relentless gunfire. They huddled together, their backs against the cold, damp wall, their hearts pounding, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Belle's shoulder throbbed with pain, the blood soaking through her shirt, staining the fabric a dark, crimson red. She leaned against the wall, her body trembling, her strength waning. Crow examined her wound, his face grim, his eyes filled with concern. "It's not too bad," he said, his voice reassuring, but Belle could see the worry in his eyes. "But we need to stop the bleeding." He tore a strip of cloth from his shirt, using it to bandage her wound, his touch surprisingly gentle, his movements careful, efficient. Belle winced in pain, but she didn't complain. She knew he was doing his best, that he was trying to help her, to protect her. As he bandaged her wound, their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to fade away, the gunfire, the danger, the chaos disappearing, leaving only the 2 of them, huddled together in the darkness, their hearts beating in unison, their breaths mingling in the close air. It was a moment of intimacy, of vulnerability, of unspoken connection. It was a moment that transcended their differences, their past, their forbidden desires. It was a moment of shared humanity, of shared struggle, of shared hope. But it was a moment that couldn't last. The gunfire resumed, shattering the silence, reminding them of the danger, of the task ahead, of the enemy that awaited them. "We need a plan," Belle said, her voice low, her gaze unwavering. "We can't stay here. We need to find Thorne. We need to end this." Crow nodded, his face grim, his eyes determined. "I know," he said.
But how?
They were trapped, cornered, with no clear way out. But they weren't defeated. Not yet. Crow had an idea, a desperate gamble, a risky maneuver that might just give them a chance. He explained his plan to Belle, his voice low, his words urgent. It was a long shot, a dangerous move, but it was their only hope. Belle nodded, her heart pounding, her adrenaline surging. She was afraid, yes, but she was also determined. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't back down. She would fight to the end, for Thomas, for herself, for the fragile hope of justice. They took a deep breath, steeling themselves for what was to come. And the fight continued, bloody and fraught, on the sandy ground of a town called Redemption's End. Chapter 18. The Quiet After the Storm. Crow's plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. He intended to use himself as bait, drawing Thorne's fire, creating a diversion that would allow Belle to flank the courthouse and get a clear shot at their tormentor. It was a gamble, a desperate play that relied on Crow's speed, his agility, and a healthy dose of luck. "Are you sure about this?" Belle asked, her voice filled with concern, her eyes searching his. She didn't want him to risk his life, not for her, not for this. "It's the only way," Crow replied, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "We're out of options, Belle.
We need to end this, now."
He gave her a quick, reassuring smile, a fleeting expression that belied the danger, the fear, the uncertainty that lurked beneath the surface. It was a smile that spoke of courage, of determination, of a willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of justice, for the sake of redemption. "Be careful," Belle whispered, her voice trembling, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to love. Crow nodded, his eyes locking with hers, a silent promise passing between them, a vow to fight, to survive, to see this through to the end. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, he darted out of the alleyway, running towards the center of the square, drawing the fire of Thorne's men, creating the diversion Belle needed. Bullets whizzed past him, kicking up dust and debris, but he didn't falter. He ran, weaving and dodging, his movements fluid, graceful, a dance with death, a desperate gamble to save Belle, to achieve their shared goal. Belle watched him, her heart in her throat, her breath held captive in her lungs. She prayed for his safety, for his survival, for his success. She also knew she couldn't just stand by and watch it all play out from this sheltered position. She took advantage of the distraction, slipping out of the alleyway, moving quickly and quietly along the side of the courthouse, her rifle raised, her finger on the trigger, her eyes scanning the rooftops, searching for Thorne. She spotted him, finally, on the roof of the courthouse, his figure silhouetted against the pale sky, his rifle raised, his attention focused on Crow. He was a clear target, exposed and vulnerable. Belle took a deep breath, calming her nerves, steadying her aim. She sighted her rifle, lining up the shot, her finger tightening on the trigger. She fired. The shot echoed through the empty square, a deafening roar that shattered the silence, a sound that signaled the end of the battle, the culmination of their journey, the reckoning that had been so long in coming. Thorne cried out, his body jerking violently, his rifle falling from his grasp. He staggered, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with disbelief, with pain, with the realization that he had been defeated. He collapsed, falling from the rooftop, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud, a lifeless heap of flesh and bone, a testament to the brutal reality of frontier justice. The gunfire ceased, the silence returning, a heavy, suffocating silence that was broken only by the sound of Belle's ragged breathing, by the pounding of her heart, by the slow, steady drip of blood from her wounded shoulder. Crow ran towards her, his face etched with relief, with concern, with a flicker of something that might have been admiration. "You did it, Belle," he said, his voice breathless, his eyes searching hers. "You got him." Belle nodded, her body trembling, her emotions overwhelming her. She'd done it. She'd avenged Thomas's death. She'd found justice, redemption, in this desolate ghost town, in this place of death and despair. But the victory felt hollow, empty. The pain, the loss, the grief remained, a constant ache in her heart, a reminder of the price she'd paid, of the sacrifices she'd made. They stood there, in the center of the square, surrounded by the carnage, by the bodies of Thorne's men, by the crumbling buildings of Redemption's End, a testament to the violence, the lawlessness, the harsh realities of life on the frontier. The quiet after the storm was deafening, a silence filled with unspoken emotions, with unanswered questions, with the uncertain future that lay ahead. Belle looked at Crow, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude, relief, and a lingering sadness. She'd found justice, yes, but she'd also lost something in the process. She'd lost her innocence, her illusions, her naive belief in the goodness of humanity.
She'd also found something.
She'd found strength, courage, resilience, a capacity for survival that she hadn't known she possessed. She'd found a connection with Crow, a bond forged in the crucible of danger, of shared struggle, of a forbidden desire that still flickered between them. Crow looked back at Belle, taking in her bloodied appearance and her haunted, tired eyes. The battle was over, but he knew the war, for both of them, was far from finished. Chapter 19. A New Dawn, a Fragile Hope. The days following the shootout at Redemption's End were a blur of activity, a whirlwind of cleaning up, of burying the dead, of dealing with the aftermath of the violence. Sheriff Abernathy arrived, drawn by the reports of gunfire, his face etched with a mixture of weariness and grim satisfaction. He listened to Belle's and Crow's account of the events, his eyes widening in disbelief, in horror, in grudging respect. He'd underestimated them, he realized, especially Belle. He'd seen her as a vulnerable widow, a victim, a woman who needed his protection. He hadn't seen the strength, the courage, the resilience that lay beneath the surface. He took charge of the situation, arresting the surviving members of Thorne's gang, arranging for the burial of the dead, sending for a doctor to tend to Belle's wound. He also cleared Belle's name, officially declaring Thomas's death a result of the feud with Silas Thorne, exonerating her from any involvement, any suspicion. The news spread quickly through the territory, carried by word of mouth, by the relentless gossip that was the lifeblood of the frontier. Belle was no longer seen as a suspect, a potential murderess. She was seen as a heroine, a woman who had faced down a notorious outlaw, a woman who had avenged her husband's death, a woman who had found justice in a lawless land. The neighboring ranchers, the ones who had been circling like vultures, waiting for her to fail, to sell, to give up, changed their tune. They offered their apologies, their condolences, their grudging respect. They saw her in a new light, not as a weak, vulnerable woman, but as a force to be reckoned with, a woman who had earned her place in this harsh, unforgiving world. Belle accepted their apologies, their condolences, their respect, but she didn't forgive them. She remembered their greed, their suspicion, their willingness to profit from her misfortune. She would never trust them, never forget their betrayal. As for Crow, he remained by Belle's side, helping her through the aftermath, offering his support, his guidance, his quiet strength. He tended to her wound, his touch gentle, his movements careful, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Something that looked dangerously close to tenderness. The unspoken attraction between them remained, a simmering tension that crackled in the air, a forbidden desire that they both fought against, that they both knew was dangerous, impossible, doomed. But they also shared a bond, a connection forged in the crucible of danger, of shared struggle, of a common enemy defeated. They understood each other in a way that no one else could. They'd seen each other at their worst, at their most vulnerable, and they'd still managed to find a measure of respect, of admiration, of something more. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Crow spoke, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I'll be leaving soon," he said, his words a statement of fact, a resignation to the inevitable. Belle nodded, her heart aching with a mixture of sadness and relief. She knew it was for the best. Their partnership had served its purpose. They'd found Thorne. They'd avenged Thomas's death. They'd cleared her name. There was nothing left for him here. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, despite her efforts to control it. He shrugged, a gesture that was both evasive and dismissive. "Back to my life," he said, his voice guarded. Back to the games, the risks, the shadows. It was a life she knew little about, a life she didn't want to be a part of. But it was his life, the life he'd chosen, the life he was destined to lead. "Will I see you again?" Belle asked, her voice barely a whisper, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. He hesitated, his eyes flickering, revealing a hint of something. Something that looked almost like regret. "Maybe," he said, his voice noncommittal, his gaze avoiding hers. "If the cards are right." It was a gambler's answer, evasive, ambiguous, offering no promises, no guarantees, no hope for a future together. Belle nodded, accepting his answer, accepting the reality of their situation, of their separate lives, of the impossible gulf that separated them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Crow stood up, preparing to leave. He looked down at Belle, his blue eyes, sharp and assessing, searching hers. "You'll be all right, Belle," he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. "You're strong. You're a survivor. You'll make it." It was a compliment, an acknowledgement of her strength, her resilience, her courage. It was also a farewell, a goodbye, a recognition that their paths were diverging, that their brief, intense, dangerous partnership had come to an end. He offered her his hand, and she took it, her fingers intertwining with his, a brief, fleeting connection that sent a shiver down her spine. It was a handshake, a gesture of respect, of gratitude, of farewell. But it was also something more. It was a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken attraction, of the forbidden desire, of the what might have beens that would forever haunt them. He mounted his horse, the leather creaking softly, a sound that seemed to amplify the silence, the emptiness, the loneliness that awaited her. He looked at her one last time, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret, admiration, and something else. Something that looked dangerously close to love. Then, with a nod, he turned and rode away, disappearing into the gathering dusk, leaving Belle alone on the porch, watching him go, her heart aching with a mixture of sadness, relief, and a fragile, flickering hope for a new dawn, a new beginning, a new life. The wind carried the scent of dust and horses, and Belle stood alone as a new day promised to break. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Belle watched Crow ride away, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared into the vast expanse of the twilight horizon. She felt a pang of loss, a familiar ache in her heart, a reminder of the loneliness that had been her constant companion for so long. But she also felt a sense of relief, of closure, of a chapter ending, a new one beginning. She turned and walked back into the ranch house, the familiar scent of wood smoke, leather, and coffee greeting her, a comforting embrace that eased the ache in her heart, the emptiness that threatened to engulf her. The house was silent, empty, but it was also filled with memories, with the echoes of Thomas's laughter, with the warmth of their shared life, with the promise of a future she would now build on her own. She spent the following days settling back into the rhythm of ranch life, overseeing the cattle, working with the hands, tending to the endless tasks that demanded her attention. The work was hard, demanding, but it was also therapeutic, a distraction from the grief, the loss, the lingering memories of Crow, of their brief, intense, dangerous partnership. The ranch hands welcomed her back, their faces etched with relief, with respect, with a newfound admiration for the woman who had faced down a notorious outlaw, who had avenged her husband's death, who had proven her strength, her courage, her resilience. Jed, the grizzled old foreman, offered her his quiet support, his unwavering loyalty, his gruff but genuine affection. He'd been with her and Thomas for years, through thick and thin, and he was like a father figure to her, a source of strength, of guidance, of unconditional love. Young Billy, the eager, enthusiastic ranch hand, looked up to her with awe, his eyes filled with admiration, with a hero worship that was both touching and embarrassing. He saw her as a legend, a symbol of the West, a woman who had defied the odds, who had overcome adversity, who had emerged victorious from the crucible of violence and loss. Belle appreciated their support, their loyalty, their affection, but she also felt a distance, a separation, a sense of being different, of having experienced something they couldn't understand, of having walked through a fire that had changed her, transformed her, made her someone new. She was no longer just a rancher's wife, a widow grieving for her lost love. She was a survivor, a fighter, a woman who had faced her demons, who had conquered her fears, who had found a strength within herself that she hadn't known she possessed. She was also a woman alone, a woman who had tasted the forbidden fruit of desire, of a connection with a man who was both dangerous and alluring, a man who had awakened something within her, something she thought had died with Thomas. She knew she would never forget Crow, his piercing blue eyes, his unsettling charm, his ruthless ambition, his unexpected tenderness. He was a part of her now, a part of her past, a part of her story, a part of the woman she had become. But she also knew that he was gone, that he belonged to a different world, a world of shadows, of games, of risks, a world she couldn't be a part of. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Belle began to rebuild her life, to create a new future for herself, a future that honored Thomas's memory, that fulfilled her own dreams, that embraced the challenges and the opportunities that lay ahead. She expanded the ranch, buying more land, increasing the size of the herd, hiring more hands. She became a successful businesswoman, a respected figure in the community, a woman who had earned her place in this harsh, unforgiving world. But she also remained true to herself, to her values, to her love for the land, for the animals, for the simple, honest life of the frontier. She found solace in the beauty of the landscape, in the vast, open skies, in the silence of the desert, in the rhythm of the seasons. One evening, as she sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep violet, she saw a rider approaching, a familiar figure on a chestnut stallion, a silhouette against the fading light. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat.
It couldn't be.
But it was. Cass Crow had returned. He rode towards her, his face weathered and lined, his blue eyes intense and searching, his posture conveying a weariness she hadn't seen before. He dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post, his movements slow, deliberate, his gaze fixed on hers. He walked towards her, stopping a few feet away, his presence filling the space between them, a silent acknowledgement of the past, of the present, of the uncertain future that lay ahead. "Belle," he said, his voice low, his tone different.
Softer.
Less guarded. "A crow," she replied, her voice trembling slightly, her heart pounding against her ribs. What are you doing here?" He hesitated, his eyes flickering, revealing a vulnerability she hadn't seen before, a raw, exposed emotion that took her breath away. I couldn't stay away," he said, his voice a choked whisper, his gaze searching hers. "I had to see you. I had to tell you." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers calloused but surprisingly tender, his touch sending a shiver down her spine, a wave of longing, of desire, of a love that had defied the odds, that had survived the violence, the betrayal, the separation. "Tell me what, Crow?" Belle asked, her voice barely audible, her eyes locked with his. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling, his gaze unwavering. "I love you, Belle," he said, his voice raw with emotion, his eyes filled with a sincerity she'd never seen before. "I've loved you since that night in the saloon 5 years ago. I've tried to deny it, to fight it, to bury it. But I can't. I won't." The words hung in the air, a revelation, a confession, a declaration of a love that had been hidden, suppressed, denied, but that had finally found its voice, its expression, its truth. Belle stared at him, her heart overflowing with emotion, with a mixture of joy, disbelief, and a profound sense of wonder. She'd never expected to hear those words, to feel this way, to have this second chance at happiness, at love, at a future she'd thought was lost forever. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, a silent promise, a vow, a commitment to a future together, a future built on love, on trust, on a shared journey through the heart of the wild, untamed frontier. The sun set, the sky ablaze with color, and Belle knew that this was not just an ending, but a new beginning. She had found herself, and she had found a love that would endure the test of time, the storms of life, and the challenges of the horizon. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the enduring power of love, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a testament to the possibility of finding happiness, of building a new life, even amidst the harsh realities of the frontier. Belle and Crow, together, transformed the ranch into a thriving enterprise, a beacon of prosperity, a symbol of hope in a land often marked by hardship and loss. They expanded their holdings, diversified their operations, and became respected figures in the community, known for their fairness, their generosity, and their unwavering commitment to the land and its people. They built a life together, a life filled with love, with laughter, with shared challenges and shared triumphs. They raised a family, children who embodied the best of both of them, children who inherited Belle's strength, her resilience, her love for the land, and Crow's courage, his determination, his sharp mind. Crow never completely abandoned his gambling ways, but he tempered his risks, his ambitions, his need for the thrill of the game. He found a new kind of gamble, a gamble on love, on family, on a future with Belle, a gamble that proved to be the most rewarding of his life. He learned to trust, to open his heart, to share his vulnerabilities, to embrace the love that Belle offered him so freely, so unconditionally. He became a better man, a more complete man, a man who had finally found his place in the world, his purpose in life, his home in Belle's arms. Belle, in turn, found a new kind of happiness, a deeper, more profound joy than she had ever known before. She had loved Thomas deeply and truly, and she would always cherish his memory, but her love for Crow was different, a love born of shared struggle, of mutual respect, of a connection that transcended their differences, their pasts, their forbidden desires. She learned to forgive, to let go of the anger, the bitterness, the resentment that had consumed her for so long. She found peace, contentment, a sense of belonging, a sense of wholeness that had eluded her for years. They grew old together, their faces etched with the lines of time, their bodies weathered by the years, their love enduring, unwavering, a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed dark and uncertain. They sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunsets, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with gratitude, with love, with the quiet joy of a life well lived, a love well earned. They had faced storms, they had endured hardships, they had overcome challenges, but they had done it together, their love a constant source of strength, of comfort, of inspiration. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting its golden glow upon the land they loved, they knew that their story, their love, their legacy would live on, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a testament to the possibility of finding redemption, of finding love, of finding a home in the heart of the wild, untamed frontier. The wind whispered through the cottonwood tree, a gentle S.